have you thought of the economic consequences behind it? And second, something closer to Australia. You've discussed the basic problems of the Brexit is ignorance and fear, which normally breeds stupidity. And I'd like to also bring it closer to home in a sense of, do you think it's about time Australia confronts its fear of dealing with its Asian neighbors and start considering applying for the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, with which we have closer interests with, being in the Asia Pacific? Thank you.
Jacob Rees-Mogg started a company with some of his chums called Somerset Asset Management. And Somerset Asset Management is a UK-based investment company, but it has opened an office in Dublin on the explicit rationale of shielding its customers from the economic ill effects of Brexit. Nothing could better encapsulate the fraud that is at the heart of this whole undertaking. For the British financial industry, at the moment, they are operating with the same regulations as across the EU, notably, of course, the other main financial capitals in the EU, Frankfurt and Paris. Frankfurt and Paris have been assiduously courting British-based financial firms to try to get them to move, and they would. After a Brexit, the possibility will begin that there will be a divergence of the regulatory regimes affecting financial transactions in those centres, and therefore British-based financial institutions will have to apply under a so-called passporting scheme to have their trades operate effectively in a single market with those in the rest of the EU. But in order to do that, they have to establish offices within the territory of the EU, and that's why a lot of them have been establishing those branches. I think the bigger question of whether, how, and to what extent having those billions and billions of pounds in investment funds in the UK actually does anyone any good. When I was still in my days as a presenter in regional ITV, one of the local members of Parliament was a certain upcoming Labour politician called Tony Blair. And in his constituency of Sedgefield, in the town of Newton Aycliffe, there was good news because a factory was established by the Fujitsu company. So it's a classic example of Britain's, what passes for Britain's industrial strategy of the past 40 years, namely foreign direct investment from countries which actually do possess the kind of innovative capacity that Britain now lacks. And Tony Blair was on hand to cut the ribbon, shake the hands, smile his trademark Cheshire Cat grin for the cameras, and disappear. About 2.5 years later, by this time Blair had become Prime Minister. But unfortunately it was bad news, because the Newton Aycliffe plant of Fujitsu was abruptly closed back down again. And I remember we had pictures of Blair addressing a meeting of workers who were now worried about their futures, and a lot of them were saying, so what are you going to do about this, Mr. Blair? You're our MP, you're now the Prime Minister. And he said, in kind of a sort of panic rising in his gorge, which politicians usually experience when they meet large numbers of articulate members of the public, and he said, look, I can't change the way the market works. And you could just see a kind of thought cloud forming above the heads of these guys saying, well, what's the point in having you then? Because if you can't, as a Labour Prime Minister with a thumping great majority, change the way the foreign direct investment market works, then there really is an open question as to what's the point of having you. And this really is one of the keys to the riddle of Brexit. The sense of ongoing large-scale dispossession among the former industrial working class of the UK, who can see the globalised world roaring past their door, but all the benefits seem to be going elsewhere, and they cannot lock in the benefits of technology. Now, of course, a lot of those foreign direct investments are in peril because ways of doing business have evolved which depend on frictionless trade across borders. and that will come to an end if there's a no-deal Brexit. I think we're all going to have to remember that John Donne, whom Stuart quoted, was actually wrong when he said, "No man is an island. There's always the Isle of Man. We can always go there."
Look, I'll be second part of your question about whether Australia should join Southeast Asia. Should be, and I want to make the distinction between being parochial and being cosmopolitan. Parochial means, you know, we'll just do what we know, we'll respond to the mother country, Britain, or we'll respond to Big Brother on the other side of the Pacific, namely the United States. My view is that, apart from anything else, it would make life more interesting to embrace other cultures and other languages, and to be culturally and intellectually promiscuous. Means breaking the boundaries, tasting ideas and peoples whom you've previously defined as of little consequence to our way of life. I think it's absurd that Keating told us years ago that we're part of Asia. We're not part of Europe anymore. Okay, next question.
Jeff Lee, welcome home, Mr. Professor Peace Studies, and welcome back, Stuart Cotter Reid.
Is this when the insults coming out?
Never happened at the Gale.
Look, I really have been trying to follow this whole Brexit thing now for the duration, but apart from your comments that you just made in response to the last question, I just can't see the bigger picture. Whether England goes in or out of the European Union, how is it going to impact upon global capitalism, and will there be any major restructuring apart from Australia dipping its Menzies style and saying we're open and available for trade again, Great Britain? What does it really mean in terms of the bigger picture, in terms of the threat of global war, climate change, and world trade in that sense? But my second question relates to culture as a result of this whole Brexit debate. As you're aware of the events in Christchurch last week and the failure of the intelligence services in New Zealand and Australia to pay any attention to the ultra-right sort of extremists, I saw on the news this afternoon a report that's saying the Brits are now going to take a closer look at the ultra-right extremists who've been fanned by the Brexit debate, and perhaps get ready to curtail any more extremism of their attacks on mosques and so on and so forth. And the third part of my question, very briefly, Paul Kelly yesterday in The Australian was lamenting the collapse of liberalism, by which he probably means the neo-colonial economic empire that's through globalisation. And Janet Albertson was underneath in The Australian saying, well, let's have a Labor government just so we can teach you all a lesson. Is Brexit part of this uncertainty about the direction of the world, with neoliberalism reaching its final endpoint, or is it something else? Thank you.
That's a very good question, and it's really ambivalent, I think, and people make different cases from different perspectives as to whether the EU should be seen as an enabler of the neoliberal ascendancy in economic policies, or as to whether it should be seen as a barrier to its further spread. It's an enabler in the kind of macroeconomic sense, because you see, I maintain that the idea of the European Union was never supposed to be implemented with these neoliberal economic policies. So those policies that are making it failed to work. In the first place, it was the European coal and steel community, with an avowed purpose of smoothing out fluctuations in the market price, the world market price of those commodities, in order to protect jobs. Okay? But latterly, we reached the point of the early 1990s, for example, the Maastricht Treaty, which mandates for the Euro countries that they must not run any more than a 2% government deficit. So that removes the kind of Keynesian demand management tools from the portfolio of governments in order to reflate economies. Just recently, there's been a dispute between the European Commission and the Italian government. The Italian government is one of these kind of Janus-facing governments. It's dominated by political parties that appeal to racism and xenophobia in order to maintain their grip on power. But in a populist sense, they had intended to inflate government spending in order to reflate the Italian economy, and that's now foreclosed, and they had to back down. Okay, so there's a kind of ambivalence at the heart of the EU as to its position vis-à-vis
the Brexit
sentiment neoliberal policies.
For example,
at a kind of basement level, I mean, what a lot of people in the UK profess to dislike about Britain's European membership is not anything necessarily to do with the EU, but the policies of British governments, including British government's attitude to the EU. Britain habitually sells itself to foreign direct investment on the basis of being a low-wage economy within the European Union. And just on a kind of everyday basis, I mean, Britain, I think uniquely among the EU countries, it is a place where American-style chains of coffee shops thrive. So you see a lot of Starbucks, and the one that kind of grows like lantana around the UK is called Costa Coffee. Corbyn, again today, or where are we at today? Yesterday, reiterated the offer of a bipartisan consensus if the terms of the motion was to be changed to commit Britain to remaining in a customs union with the EU. That would ensure that all those protections and regulations remained in place. It would also foreclose doing independent free trade deals with the rest of the world. Okay? May, the important point for May is to get party advantage out of it by appearing to get Brexit through despite the Labour Party. And that's what is restricting the range of options that are under consideration.
first female questioner.
Hi, my name's Ashley. It's my first time at the Politics at the Pub, so thank you for having us and thank you for being here.
Hold the mic down.
So Theresa May is on her way to Brussels right now to ask for an extension to Article 50. Should she not get it, we've only got 8 days left until we're at the official deadline. So this has been 3 years in the making and we still haven't done anything yet. What, in your opinion, do you think will happen? Let's say she gets rejected for her extension, but apparently it's unlikely. What do you think will happen in 8 days' time? Like, touched on the Irish border, plus something like that's heavily regulated, like aviation or food.
Well, I mean, let's go for two of the three: food and the Irish border. And the Tories, in the event of a no-deal Brexit, will be in a position not a million miles away from that in which they found themselves in the 19th century over the Corn Laws. And back then, tariffs were in place to prevent the importation of grains from overseas, which the Tories under Robert Peel wanted to keep because that protected the market for their own supporters, the landowners. However, it, of course, kept the price of bread above what people could afford. Eventually, they were prevailed upon to abolish the Corn Laws in order to bring the price of bread down. And they will face the same dilemma in the event of a no-deal Brexit. And what they've said is that farming will be one sector in the 17% of trade where tariffs will be imposed. In the other 83% of trade, the British government will not impose tariffs in order to keep prices down. Farming will be in the 17%, except in Northern Ireland. So there won't be any tariffs on this range of goods in Northern Ireland, which means that, you know, it's like switching on a huge illuminated sign saying free money, get it here. And it means that people only have to bring those goods into Northern Ireland and then take them somewhere else within the UK. And at the very least, the profit they will make will be the percentage tariff that everyone else has paid.
So they'll go up by 50%.
But of course now, or should I say now, the farmers who are the bedrock of support for the unionists, the so-called garden centre unionists, are rightly squealing because they will point out that what will happen is that a range of agricultural produce will be brought into Northern Ireland which has been produced in conditions that we ourselves would not accept. We are prevented from having those conditions, and rightly so. So therefore animal welfare conditions, hygiene conditions, these imports can flood into Northern Ireland, tariff-free.
Non-chlorinated chicken over the border.
Sorry, say again?
They can get a trebuchet and throw a non-chlorinated chicken over the border.
That's right, that's right. It's like the famous anthem of the Brits on holiday, isn't it? You know, wave a chicken in the air, stick in the joke, you'll know.
Got two quick responses to, you know, what's going to happen. What's already happening, apparently, is that British people are hoarding like mad. They are hoarding medicines. They are hoarding the things they can hoard, which probably won't be affected by Brexit anyway. Kind of canned fruit. It's the daily massive supply of fresh products which they can't hoard. You can't hoard a cabbage for 10 weeks, as far as I know, and expect it still to be fresh. The other issue that we haven't really touched on, it's surprising that given that it's Jake's bread and butter, is about the behaviour of the media. There's a massive campaign by the right-wing, sorry, I said I wouldn't use that adjective, by the tabloid media to say Brexit is Brexit, that Britain must be independent. So that campaign persists, and because it's a sort of binary question, either or, that's what people, that was what was so fraudulent about the whole referendum business.
Saying Brexit means nothing, essentially.
Yeah.
Thank you.
The anti-Semitism campaign against Corbyn is disgusting as well.
Yeah, well, Brian, we could deal with that in a minute as well, yeah.
I'm playing a little bit devil's advocate here, but Jeremy Corbyn seems to be vacillating the issue of Brexit. He's been criticised by elements of momentum for not taking the matter to a people's new referendum vote. There are concerns that if Britain re-enters the European Union, Labour's radical socialisation agenda may be stymied with the European Union. I'm thinking of two books, one by Kostas Lapavistas, a Greek, of course, The Left Case Against the European Union, and another by Philip Wyman, The Left Case for Brexit. And basically they're saying that the European Union has essentially become a bankers' union or a debtors' prison, if you look at Greece. And, quote, the European left's attachment to the European Union as an inherently progressive development prevents it from being radical, and indeed integrates it into the neoliberal structures of European capitalism. The left has become increasingly cut off from its historic constituency, the workers and the poor of Europe, who have naturally sought a voice elsewhere. So would a customs union, would that necessarily give Labour the freedom to implement its radical agenda more effectively than being part of the European Union? How do we change the European Union, from within or from without, to make it better?
Well, look, I'm more of a critic of Jeremy Corbyn than Jake is. I mean, Corbyn and lots of Labour diehards have always tried to behave as though they were not really Europeans. I mean, because this thing, that ditch called the English Channel somehow separated them. And so there's been absurd scepticism about Europe by the Labour Party. and the argument about peace with justice in our time, which was part of the rationale for joining the European Union, is never ever mentioned. I mean, this was a scene of appalling carnage for years. On the question of the terrible bureaucracy that is the European Union, it's no worse than any other bureaucracy. Take the business of home affairs, the so-called home affairs, or the administrative appeals tribunal in this country, which is invisible, unaccountable, corrupt, a bunch dominated by fear. I mean, Britain totally underestimates the enormous benefits that have accrued to the British Isles as a result of being a member of the European Union. You know, you can reel them off: the clearance of sewage from British beaches, the lowering of telephone calls, considerable advances in technology and research in medicine. But all that gets that's not on the agenda. And my experience of being outside the door of bureaucracies is it's very difficult banging on the door to influence them. But when you sit around the table as a member, then you have a voice and you can do something about it. You can't just say like a child, but it's nothing to do with me. And there was a question tonight on the money programme just before I came in here about what Britain should do to improve what was going on with Brexit, and the Economist guy, who'd been pretty impressive, said they should grow up.
Britain's richest man is called Sir Jim Ratcliffe, and he is supposed to have a personal fortune of £21 billion, which he made from pharmaceuticals. And he was a big backer of the Leave campaign, and he's a tax exile in Monaco. But one of his latest projects is to finance the invention or the creation of it was supposed to be a new all-British four-wheel drive called, I think it's called the Defender, to take over from the legendary short-wheelbase Land Rover favoured by the British Armed Forces. Only he recently announced that his engine would be made by BMW, and he'd already announced that his bodywork would be made by a different German company. And because Britain has not had any industrial strategy to replace its industrial base following the devastation of monetarism under Thatcher, instead it's tried to import other people's industrial strategies through foreign direct investment. And that's why Sir Jim Ratcliffe has found that Britain lacks this capacity. Now, how did rich countries such as Britain build up such capacity in the first place? Not by implementing the kind of Washington consensus of free trade and freedom of capital, but by having tariff barriers behind which they could grow and diversify key industries. So that is the grain of sense within what is called the Lexit case, and is the left-wing case for Brexit. Take another example. A few years ago, one of the things that Corbyn would hopefully deliver on if he ever got the chance is renationalising the railways. I attended a Labour conference once and saw the Labour leader in his leader's speech say the following words: there will be a publicly owned, publicly accountable railway system under a Labour government. The year was 1995 and the leader was Tony Blair. Of course, New Labour never delivered on that. It's still waiting on the platform, as it were, for that to arrive. Corbyn might do it. There is an enormous amount of work to be done to replenish both rails and rolling stock, certainly at least throughout the north of England. And as things stand, all that work would be likely to be awarded to companies from elsewhere in the EU, notably German engineering firms. Same thing happened a few years ago. There was a big contract up for new rolling stock for lines in the English Midlands. One of the bidders was the Bombardier factory, which had been going for over 100 years in Derby. It lost out to a German company and probably went out of business. So the Corbyn view, the Lexit view, would say, okay, let's use the elbow room we would gain by not being bound by single market rules to decide to award such contracts to the local firms, because we like the local firms and we want the people there to keep their jobs. Well, two snags for that. First of all, you'd have to be very careful not to fall foul of WTO rules, because that would be the default trading regime in which Britain would enter. And secondly, again, other countries within the European Union have used the rules successfully and, on average, spend as a proportion of GDP about 4 times what Britain spends on aid to industry. Because they can get things like, if you're a German company, you can go to the regional lending bank and get a soft loan that you don't have to start repaying for 15 years on grounds that what you're doing is investing in skills and training. The British government only doesn't do that because it's ideologically opposed to it, not because of EU rules. So that, I think, is a key misunderstanding at the heart of the Lexit case.
But will it impede his radical social agenda?
Well, that would be one aspect of his radical social agenda, to use public spending. And Britain can use public spending. Britain is not bound by the 2% deficit limit because it's not a euro bearing country. It's opted out of the euro. So Britain could undertake Keynesian deficit funding. Indeed, the previous great fraud before Brexit in British politics was at the 2010 election, which was all about the deficit. Whereas, Britain started counting its deficit about 250 years ago when it emerged as an industrial power. And for 200 of those 250 years, the deficit and the debt have both been higher as a percentage of GDP than they were then. Labour governments invariably borrow less and pay back more in public finances than Tory ones. These are the facts. Of course, it was, never let the facts get in the way of the good story. But at that point, Britain could have instead set a much more sustainable trajectory for deficit reduction, using public spending to cushion and ameliorate these kind of market forces that have impoverished people. And under a Labour government, it certainly would have at least some of the policy tools at its disposal that it would need to reflate and implement a full industrial strategy, even as part of the EU.
And the majority of momentum are in support of people's vote.
Yeah.
Last question. This will be the last question.
Tony Blair is an unconvicted war criminal. Shame.
This is sort of a comment and a question. It strikes me that the greatest gift to people who want to run dodgy elections and or referendums, so-called referenda, is non-compulsory voting. Because look at the United States. They have put the election in almost the middle of winter, or the second Tuesday in November or something. So of course the only people who are going to schlep out in the snow and whatnot are people who are really committed. England, the same thing. Apparently Brexit had a very low turnout. In Australia, where we do, thank God, thank goodness, have compulsory voting, even if you don't really have strong views, you're forced to think about it. So these people who promote these outrageous ideas without any foundation get away with it. When you're actually forced to think about it before you vote, you do sort of sift through the ideas a little bit. So I think England has been sold. The poor people think of this huge emotional cry back to, basically, Gilbert and Sullivan. I might have been, I think I'm an Englishman, at least I'm an Englishman, I might have been a Prussian, an Italian, Turk or Russian, but I am an Englishman. But I mean, that's the cry, is that, it's an emotional credicure back to the days when England was the premier country in the world. And it's terribly sad they've been sold this absolutely dodgy thing, and they've had nobody's really got into it properly before it all happened.
Look, in policy terms, the maintenance of public ignorance is the best way to deceive and to ration scarce resources. And maintaining people in a state of ignorance, which in a way is what whether it was deliberate or not, I've no idea, which is what happened in the referendum. There were more issues not mentioned. There were plenty of massive deceptions, such as the claim about the 350 million quid to return every week to the National Health Service. I think
very low turnout.
Yeah, you used the phrase being forced to understand or being obliged to comprehend what was going on. as a virtue of compulsory voting. I think it's about a permanent civics education, even if it only reaches a climax in the few days before state and federal elections. But that doesn't go on in Britain. Britain was sold a pup with this either-or question. I understand that a couple from Britain were recently asked who were on holiday in South Australia, why they voted for Brexit. They said, so that we can eat our own apples. And that was about the level of political sophistication that characterised a lot of the deliberations about the referendum. And Jake's now going to speak on behalf of the Cox's Orange Pippin and Golden Russells.
Well, they'd be lucky if they could eat British apples, because there won't be anyone to pick them. No, Britain has a massive crisis of democracy. We need the voting age lowered to 16. We need a massive programme of civic education in schools and in the public at large, in continuing education. We need massive reforms to the political system, and the first past the post system is what that corrals people into these either-or choices, which really are increasingly at odds with the nature of the questions that are attempted to be forced through that system. And all those issues were exposed by the Brexit vote. Yeah, the fruits are bitter indeed, whether they're British apples or French apples.
Question from the filmmaker, please.
Okay, can we have in the interest of democracy, shall we have a vote as to whether the filmmaker can ask a question? No, go on, Kathy, go ahead.
Might be my last time.
Okay, so if it finally does come through to the second referendum, do you think they'll keep the Cambridge Analyticas, the aggregate IQs, and the Dominic Cummings and the Robert Mercers out of the picture this time?
Well, it won't be Cambridge Analytica, but it might be a similar firm. But look, I mean, the biggest hope is that this, right? I mean, my wife's cousin Stephen married a lady called Sandra, who is of Sri Lankan heritage, and they live in Kent. And she told me that in the days after the Brexit referendum, when she was out shopping in Maidstone, old biddies, as she put it, would come up to her and say, "You have to go home now." Now, the biggest hope for the second referendum is that since the first one, 3 years worth of rancid old racists have dropped off their perch to be displaced on the electoral rolls by young people who have a future and don't want it compromised.
Yeah.